Hi, this is Sadashiva Pai from Science Mission. We have today Dr. Tor Wager, Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience and Cognitive Sciences at the University of Colorado, with us. So as of July 2019, he is joining the faculty of Dartmouth College as a professor there. So he has received his PhD from University of Michigan in cognitive psychology in 2003 and served as an assistant and associate professor at the Columbia University from 2004 to 2009. Since 2004, he has directed the Cognitive and Effective Neuroscience Lab, a research lab devoted to work on the neurophysiology of affective processes, pain, emotion, stress, empathy, and how they are shaped by cognitive and social influences. Dr. Vega and his lab are also dedicated to developing analysis methods for functional neuroimaging and sharing ideas, tools, and scientific data with the scientific community and public. So he has also published more than 100 peer-reviewed articles, and he's in the editorial board of several journals. So welcome, Dr. Wager, to Science Hangout.
Thank you. Hi, everybody.
Hi. Tell me about your background, education, a little bit about that.
Yeah, so before I ended up at Michigan for my PhD, I majored in music, and I was a music theory and composition major.
Okay.
But I wasn't very good at music. So I graduated knowing that I wasn't going to be a professional musician. I should never do that. And I really started thinking about what is it that I want to contribute to the world? What am I interested in? I've been interested in scholarship and science for a long time. It's a good fit for me. And I thought, what's the coolest thing ever to study? And it's the brain, obviously. So early on, I had this experience where I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I really realized that if I didn't choose something, I wasn't going to choose anything and nothing was going to happen. And then I just got really excited about starting to study the brain. So I took my music degree. I learned to work hard, in music, and I learned to struggle, not be that good at things. And then I applied that to something that I think is a better fit. And started taking classes in neuroscience and neural networks and in cognitive psychology. The rest is history, essentially. But I really felt like, that's a path sort of opened up for me to be able to do this. And I've pursued it ever since, and I love it.
Okay. Yeah. Let's talk about a little bit about your lab people, and also just give a little bit more description of your lab, people, and all.
Yeah. I love my lab. It's a terrific group of people. They've contributed everything to the work that I'm going to show you. I've done a lot of the hard work. One thing that I like about the lab, it's an experimental research lab. We do a lot of work with human brain imaging. So we're trying to devise tasks that capture feeling states, pain, emotion, stress, compassion, empathy in people, and then try to understand what is it about the brain systems that we can measure with fMRI mainly and other things that really capture that or that predict that or create that response. So there's a lot of experimental design, a lot of cognitive psychology, a lot of emotion theory and affective theory, some psychophysiology, and a lot of computation and statistical principles and computational principles, and now machine learning techniques and other things that we're bringing to bear. Okay. So it's very diverse methodologically. It's very integrative. And my lab has been very diverse, I think, geographically as well. We've had people in the lab at one time from 8 different countries, which has been really a lot of fun. I think people come in and they seem to understand that it's really, we're working for a win-win situation. We're all promoting each other. There's tons of work to do, and our success depends on us being able to collectively do it fast and well. So I'm a real believer that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And I think people in my lab get that. And, that makes me really happy.
Okay. Yeah, like you have a long career and you have interacted with many people. Can you talk about your mentors, because which is crucial in the development of a scientist? So, who has helped you, supported you over the years in getting to where you are right now?
Yeah, I think many people have inspired me and taught me something. I
Okay.
think so. I'll pick out a few people, but I think there's so many
Mm-hmm.
people who have influenced me and made me a better person and scientist.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of thinking about this question, I think we kind of pick and choose the things that we really like and admire from different places and different people.
Mm-hmm.
So one person for me is my graduate advisor, Ed Smith.
Mm-hmm.
He exemplified really a kind of kindness, but also combined with honesty.
Mm-hmm.
So if we didn't like an idea, we didn't understand it, he wouldn't hold back. He'd tell you what he really thought. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think you always know where you stand with him.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really important. And another thing I learned from him is about keeping connected with old friends. When he passed away, he had people that he had known, come to see him before that, and come to his festschrift from his childhood. And he really kept connected to those
Connect.
people. Um, my other co-advisor, John Janides, is sort of for me exemplified of being focused and direct. He
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't pull any punches. If he doesn't believe something or like something, he tells you,
Uh-huh.
and that gives you it communicates that we're strong enough to handle criticism, and that it makes you better.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Um, I've had a number of mentors, give me critical feedback or tell me where I was going wrong, and that's really important. Um, Another one of my mentors was from my music days in undergraduate. Marie, now she goes by Marie Juret, but she was a flutist in orchestra and really played with the best, some of the most famous performers and conductors. And she was conducting the orchestra at our little college where everybody was kind of like, not so great. And sometimes she would look and she'd say, stop, stop, stop. And then she would just kind of smile and say, let's play. So a lot of forbearance and grace, really. I call that grace. But I also think that she also taught me about the pursuit of excellence. And if you really want to be excellent at something, there's a standard that you want to aspire to. And it's really much different than what most people, the average person around you is going to pursue, right?
Mm-hmm.
So really, I think in music too, and in dance and other things like that, people really pursue these standards of excellence, right? Because it's on display for the world,
Right.
to see. Um, Merle Holloman is another person who taught me the same thing in dance, and many other people, really.
Okay, that's good. Like I know you are busy with all your research grant, interacting with the students, and all those things. So, how do you spend your free time? Like, what are your hobbies? And in case, if at all you do anything, sometimes people don't have time. I understand that.
I'll tell you what I used to do is a lot of
Uh-huh.
things. But I like to say you have time for two things, and your
Uh-huh.
career is one thing,
One thing,
and family is one thing.
one thing. Yeah.
And I really I gave up a lot of my hobbies when I started graduate school and really focused in.
Yeah.
But I do believe in living a balanced life. I was
Yeah.
into a lot of things before, ceramics, making pottery, sculpture, music, yoga, skiing, tennis, biking, martial arts, ballet for a time, lots of different sports, a lot of outdoor sports, hiking and camping and kayaking,
Mm-hmm.
favorite thing, whitewater. And now I spend time with the family. I work, I run,
Okay.
and I do Twitter sometimes.
Yeah.
I try to get it. We're playing squash these days, so
Okay.
I think I try to keep some balance, but really a lot of focus on the family.
Yeah. Okay. Now going back to the work part. So tell me something about some of the stuff you are doing, and eventually you can go and present your work, basically.
Yeah, we're doing a lot of different things surrounding really sort of two themes that complement each other. One theme is trying to develop better models and measures of the brain systems and how they are specifically linked to things that we care about measuring, like pain or various kinds of emotions, or feelings of warmth and empathy. So do a lot of work on those things. So building measures, and then once you have the measures in the brain, then you can use those to understand interventions. So what kinds of factors influence those things? Does a mindfulness intervention do something for you? Does self-regulation or trying to sort of reframe things in your mind, does that actually help you, and how, and what does it do? As you'll see, we do a lot of work giving people placebo medications, so sham medications, because what we're doing is we're manipulating their expectations and their beliefs and understanding what are the causal effects of those expectancies and beliefs on outcomes that we care about. So a lot of this intervention stuff is focused around this idea of what can you do with your mind, with your thought, with especially your sort of conscious conceptual thought that matters in terms of shaping the course of your life and your outcomes.
Okay. Yeah. So you can present your work whenever you have a chance.
Sure. I'll launch into it. So the talk I'm going to give today is about one of my really first loves in research, which is placebo effects. And it extends from some old work into some new work that we're doing now. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully you can see it there. There. Yep. You should see Boulder, Colorado, and where it is on the Earth as we zoom out. So here we go. I'll just let you see it. For those of you who don't live in Colorado, there we are in the world. Okay, this is the Ebers Papyrus. This is one of the oldest known pharmacopoeias. It documents over 700 ancient medicines that were used in Egypt and the surrounding area. And some of those things would be familiar today. So for example, if you had a headache, you might get a tincture of wormwood, which is related to present-day absinthe, and opium, which is related to opiates, of course. And some of these seem very strange. So if you were poisoned, you might get powdered emerald or bezoar stones, which are undigested matter from the intestines of animals. And many other treatments, including human sweat, feces of humans and animals, tapeworms, and other kinds of worms. One of my favorites is usnea, which is moss scraped from the skull of a hung criminal. This is much later in Europe during the Enlightenment period, and also much later, powdered Egyptian mummy itself. And I think the first thing to note is all of these things are probably not helpful at all. They're really all placebos, and many of them are harmful. I mean, we would never take them today. But these were given to the rich as well as the poor. So this was King Charles, when he had an illness, was treated with a pint of blood extracted from his arm and his shoulder. Now, bleeding was a very, very common treatment, endemic, for thousands of years. It's very few medical uses today. Followed by an emetic, 2 physics, an enema with 15 substances. They shaved his head. They raised a blister, which is an analog of modern day cupping. You could see this in the last Olympics still. Sneezing powder, emetics, bleeding, pitch and pigeon dung on his feet. A bunch of herbs, 40 drops of extract of human skull, the bezoar stone aforementioned, after which His Majesty died. So a question that I like to ask is how, in spite of the seemingly obvious fact today that these things are bogus treatments and dangerous, really, to give, did they last for so long? And what was the benefit, and why didn't people figure out earlier that these things were really bad for you? And I think that the answer relates to the benefits of the act of care itself and the rituals that surround it, and even some of the novelty that surrounds getting this very strange treatment. And so some of those benefits are benefits that we now think of as related to the placebo effect. And they're also related to what Frank Peabody, many, many years later in the early 1900s, said, which is the secret of caring for the patient is caring for the patient. But now we think of procedures and biological processes, and we have lost a lot of the idea of care. So obviously a lot of benefits and some costs as well. When we look at things like responses to surgery, higher up on the y-axis here means a greater response to surgery across multiple conditions, pain, obesity, gastric reflux, and other conditions. What we see is a treatment response that sometimes can be quite large, but it wasn't until much later, after many of these treatments were put into practice and widely used, that people started wondering, well, is it really the surgery I'm doing that's especially effective? And what they started doing then is comparing those surgeries to sham surgeries, where they would do, let's say, a superficial incision and not complete the whole surgery. And what you see is, in many of those cases, people improve substantially. And sometimes they improve as much or almost as much as with the real treatment. So that suggests that it's not the specific surgery itself, but the whole ritual practice of being subjected to that treatment and a form of care. One of the best known examples is arthroscopic knee surgery, where some years ago, Bruce Mosley, who was the team physician for the Houston Rockets sports team, started getting curious about this in the area of knee surgery. And at first reaction was, it can't be. This is surgery we're talking about, right? It's got to be real. It seems like there are mechanisms. But then he did a sham surgery study. And I'll show you a little clip from the BBC of his study.
We had a very elaborate ruse, if you will. I would play a videotape on the TV of a real surgery. And while I was watching the TV, I would ask for instruments and pass things back and forth and carry on conversation as if it was what I would really have done if what was happening on the TV screen was actually going on during that surgery.
Can you describe?
Okay, now what we're going to see at this point is the reporter here talking to a patient and his wife, and he's first going to describe what his pain was like before the surgery, and then they're going to describe life after the surgery. And the important thing here is this is a sham surgery. So they were in the placebo condition.
What the pain was like before the operation?
Terrible, awful. I didn't think that it could be any worse. And after that,
after the surgery,
I was able to do that.
He could. Woo. We could go dancing. He took me dancing, and he could dance all night.
I went from being a skeptic to a believer. I realized that we were really onto something. There are clearly cases where we do surgeries, and it's as much or more the patient's feeling about the surgery that influences the result as the actual surgery itself.
So for some people, there can be a substantial benefit even without an active treatment. And as a result, many treatments across widely accepted clinical procedures, once clinical trials are done, end up not being superior to placebo treatments in randomized controlled trials. That doesn't mean it's not helpful for anybody, but it means overall the benefits of the treatment are largely placebo in some cases. And this is true for arthroscopic knee surgery, for vertebroplasty, for bone fractures, epidural steroid injections for back pain, and even, this is a strange case, but it came out a couple years ago now, stents for angina or chest pain, which is related to heart disease. So these are all very established treatments, and placebo effects can also be large and confound other kinds of trials of emerging treatments, like gene therapy for Parkinson's disease, which this particular trial failed spectacularly. Also, deep brain stimulation for depression, which is something that a lot of us had a lot of hope about. And this paper, the trial was stopped early because even though all the patients in the study were severely depressed, didn't respond to multiple treatments, I think it's about 23% of them responded to deep brain stimulation, and 18% responded to placebo. So there was no difference. Placebo effects are also growing across time, but drug effects are not. So the drug-placebo difference is shrinking. And in certain areas, like some of these areas, it's getting harder and harder to demonstrate a true drug effect and get drugs to market, and partly due to the large placebo response. This isn't just a problem for clinical trials. For many of us, it is an opportunity. It really provides a window into the treatment context and its effects on health and healing. And if you think about a standard visit to a physician who gives you an injection, let's say, there are many different elements of this context. There is the place itself. There is the interaction with the doctor, both her verbal suggestions when she says, this is going to make you feel better. I've seen people like you get better. And the nonverbal communication, the way she holds her body, the eye gaze, the cues in the voice, and other cues like the white coat itself. There are also specific treatment cues, the act of taking that pill, the act of getting a needle puncture or a surgery. And of course, there's a rich internal context, which is the change in one's expectations about recovery, one's beliefs about the future and what now is going to happen in the future. Are you going to live with disability? Are you going to die? Are you going to recover? And associated emotions. So lots of fear and anxiety, which can have, in many cases, and for some people, very profound effects on the course of pain and also on the course of function with things like motor disorders like Parkinson's disease. What I like to say is that we put all these pieces together into a picture or a schema, which is, who are we? Where are we now in the situation, in the course of illness, in the course of recovery, in the course of being cared for? And how do these pieces all fit together into an overall picture of who I am and how this affects me? And it's that schema, which is probably partly conscious and partly unconscious, that has potentially a large effect on our outcomes. So some of these are conscious, like I said, some of them are not conscious. And with placebo treatments, we can capture many of these things. Some of these effects can be harnessed clinically. So we've studied this over the past 15 years by giving people various kinds of placebo treatments, injections, IV, pills, nasal sprays, and creams. And this is a summary of what I like to call placebo 1.0, which is the first decade or so of placebo imaging. And this is all what's happening during pain. So during pain, when you get a placebo analgesic designed to relieve pain, there are activity decreases in all the areas you see here in blue. So each one of those spheres comes from a different study. And their activity increases in the areas shown in orange and red. And the colors just show you that there are both causal effects of the placebo, where the placebo compared to no treatment causes a reduction in activity or an increased activity. And there are also correlations with analgesia, the amount of pain relief a person feels in the same areas. And these areas involve, largely speaking, decreases in pathways that process nociceptive information or pain-related information and create the feelings of suffering and aversion and avoidance surrounding pain, including parts of the thalamus you see here, the somatosensory cortex, S2 and posterior insula, and parts of the anterior cingulate cortex and anterior mid-insula. And the areas that show increases are also very interesting because these are potential mechanisms of pain relief. So there's increases in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which maintains a lot of information about context and goals. In the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which we've been writing a lot about. We think it's really important for putting together that schema or that picture of who you are in this situation and how things affect you, and associated subcortical areas, which change value learning and autonomic responses and other things. So that's a little snapshot. And part of what placebo research has done for us is help us to change our views of what pain and other symptoms are. And we used to think that this is something that happens to you. Pain is in your back alone, or in your joints, or in your neck. And all of these nociceptive pathways that you see here in blue carry information to the brain, to various regions. And then the pain just kind of happens. But what we're learning is, version 2, that all of these areas that receive input from the body are also targeted by so-called top-down circuits, like the medial prefrontal cortex, which can modify activity in every one of these brain regions. And people really thought about this initially as a pain inhibition circuit, the pain off switch. But what we're learning is it's probably a lot more complicated than that. Instead of just being a very elaborate off switch for pain, if we think of it as contextualizing, when should you feel pain, how much, in what situation? And so it contains a set of priors, beliefs, and expectations is one way to think about it. And if they're unconscious predictions, that can help shape when we think we should be feeling pain and when we shouldn't. And so an example is, if you step on a thorn and it's a very safe context, you know what it is, it's clean and sterile, and it's not going to damage your foot, it might not be very painful. But if it were in the middle of the jungle and, this is something that might carry disease and that this is potentially deadly, then the danger associated with that pain is much greater. And in fact, the brain may just well turn up that experience and amplify the nociceptive signaling. So we think about this as a way of contextualizing when you should be feeling what. And more broadly, instead of something that just happens to you, pain, like other symptoms, is an active inference that your brain makes. It's not just that you have a certain amount of sensory input. It's this decision by your brain that says, hey, this is really bad. This is something important for me. And it's important because it predicts a future outcome, future damage, future disability, future death, things like that. So they're all active inferences. They're based in part on sensory evidence coming in from your body, but in part on those priors or prior information that you have about what you should be feeling. So all symptoms, I believe now, are inferred experiences. And of course, that's not just the experience that's important, but also the physiological responses in the body are driven in the same way. And it can also shape learning, which is what you take away from experiences over time. And that's particularly important. So I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. But next, I want to turn to one other idea. So a lot of work has been done over the last century on classical conditioning. And many things can be classically conditioned, including immune responses, which is really fascinating, autonomic responses, and other things. And so a real question has been, okay, so classical conditioning can work, but what does it matter what something means to you, how you evaluate it consciously and conceptually? So that's been something we've been pursuing in the lab for a long time. We think that the ventromedial PFC plays a really important role here. So one way of thinking about this is that the brain is full of pattern generators. In the pons, there are visceral pattern generators that will track changes in the environment and in body temperature, and if you're, let's say, too cold, trigger a thermoregulatory response. So this involves the coordination of 6 different things, including your hair standing on end, your blood vessels dilating in some parts of your body and constricting in others, in your feet and hands, for example, pushing blood to the core, behavioral responses like shivering, and other changes as well, all designed around the same goal. So what this pontine nucleus is doing is it's detecting an environmental pattern. You're too cold, and generating an adaptive response by coordinating multiple systems. So then the idea is that's a fundamental function of the brain. And as you move up into the midbrain and some of these areas like the PAG you see there, which is quite important for pain control, what they do, very broadly speaking, is they're pattern generators that detect organism-environment interactions. I'm being attacked by a predator. I have to fight or flee. I have to do something, and multiple systems are coordinated. I've just eaten something terrible that might kill me. I better curl up in a ball and, you know, do various things to prevent, you know, a toxic response. And as we move up, then what's the cortex for? We have this massive, you know, 20 billion or more neurons in the cortex alone. And one view of what they do is they're also pattern generators, but now they're conceptual pattern generators. They're for detecting situational schemas like first date or lunch with a friend or taking care of a sick child, and these complicated situations that involve the coordination of many different kinds of cognition. So those kinds might be an appraisal of the social context, how your body's feeling, the interoceptive context, and what's happening in your body, your expectations about specific events, your memories for past events and similar situations in the past, and you put them all together into a picture of where you are and what the situation is that you find yourself in. And so the VMPFC, there's lots of evidence that points to this. Some things that I think are really great are some nice integrative work by Jeff Schoenbaum on the idea that the orbitofrontal cortex has neurons that code for expectations about specific future outcomes. Other work by Dan Schachter and Randy Buckner and others on imagining the future and being able to form a rich representation of what might happen to you or what you think will happen to you. And other work by Todd Hare and Antonio Rangel and Emily Falk on integrating goals into decision making. So like if you have a goal to lose weight, then certain foods might seem less appealing to you if that information is integrated properly. And that's exactly the kind of work that shows that information is integrated between your goals and what your other sort of impulses are in the ventromedial PFC. Hilke Plasman is another person who's been doing work on this for years and how your food choices are modified in this way. So one of the ideas, there's lots of evidence that sort of points to this, but this is one of the ideas that I found particularly theoretically interesting. And it involves the VMPFC, but I'll get back to that in a second. So first of all, there are cells called grid cells in the hippocampus and surrounding entorhinal cortex. And the idea is that they help organisms, mammals, navigate the spatial environment by responding in this sort of hexagonal grid. And what that does is allows people and rodents and so forth to form a map of where you are in space, in this directional space, and use that to navigate. And when people look for where those grid-like cells are with human fMRI, the first place they found them was in the hippocampal and perihippocampal cortices. But the next place also is in the ventromedial PFC. So now there was another really interesting experiment that was done by Alex Constantinescu and Tim Behrens a couple of years ago now. And they created a conceptual space. In very brief, by showing people these pictures where they had to learn that the neck of these little birds can grow and the legs can grow. Essentially, that forms a two-dimensional space. And what they do then is have a training task where they have to learn what the relationships are between these different combinations. And they have another training task that you see over there too, where you sort of learn to navigate in conceptual space. And then, in long story short, they look for activity in human imaging that looks like it tracks things in this hexagonal 6-direction pattern that corresponds to grid cells. And the VMPFC is one of their strongest results. So then from this comes the idea, so we extrapolated from that and thought, yes, this fits because it's important for forming a conceptual map. And when you form that picture of any conceptual situation, like yourself in a doctor's office getting a treatment, this is the kind of operation that you'll do. You'll put these pieces together into a conceptual map, and that conceptual map will involve yourself. So you can see that here on the right, when you have many different sort of context elements and you have a representation of yourself, and there are relationships, and you put things close to you, essentially. And the closer something is to you in this map, then the more emotional it becomes, the more hot it becomes. So things that are close to you impinge on your survival and well-being. And that's why you generate emotional responses. You'll activate the autonomic nervous system. Your skin will sweat. Your pupils will dilate. Your blood pressure will go up as these things are really relevant to you. So going back to what do we think this area is doing, we think that it is not just an on or off switch for pain or emotion, but it's providing this rich, multidimensional set of prior expectations based on a representation of the situation. And this is perhaps why the ventral medial PFC seems to play an important role in virtually every mental health disorder that I know of, including chronic pain, which is partly a mental health disorder as well as a physical disorder, I now believe, depression, PTSD, anxiety, stress-related disorders, and drug abuse as well, and substance use disorders. So that's a bit about the conceptual part. And now I'm going to turn to the learning part. And the idea then is if a placebo treatment can shape your expectations about what's coming and where you fit in and what's going to happen after you get a treatment and alter those things, then it might change the course of learning and how you respond to new information. So this is really an interaction between those conceptual systems that generate expectations and other systems in your brain that are learning what's valuable, what should I avoid, what should I pursue. And that's a process that changes over time, right? It evolves over time. So here are two curious observations about placebo effects to me. You can ask, well, what happens if you just start making suggestions to people? Forget about training them or conditioning them, just tell them they're going to get better. And often those effects are very weak. So suggestion alone does not necessarily have a large placebo effects. What about conditioning alone? Just pairing treatment cues like a needle puncture or other cues with outcomes, without telling them anything. Well, surprisingly, that also often has weak effects alone. It seems as though you really need both things working together. So you need the right kind of beliefs and expectations initially, and then you need experiences that reinforce that say, yes, I was right, that belief was right. If you have those two things together, your brain learns that this is true. So I like to think of this as, I've called this the dance of the placebos before, I like that, which is really a dance between conceptual processes, suggestions, expectation, your appraisal of what things mean to you, and your attributions, which relates to what do you think caused you to get better? So you have a headache, you take a pill, you get better. Was it the pill that made you better, or would you have gotten better anyway? In fact, in that instance, you don't know, because you don't know what would have happened. But you make a causal attribution. And if you believe that it was the pill that made you better, then you're going to learn that that pill is good in the future. You're going to take it more often in the future, and it might even acquire analgesic properties. So it's this dialogue between conceptual processes and plasticity in neural circuits that are guided by experience. So this is an example of how placebo treatments can shape the learning process, where we can really see a learning effect. And this was a study we did a few years ago in Parkinson's disease patients. And what each patient did is bring in their daily medication, which is generally Cinemet, which is mostly L-Dopa, and we dissolved it in a cup of orange juice. And we told them, you're going to drink this orange juice, and then we're going to scan you doing a couple of tests that I'll tell you about in a second. But in fact, when we dissolved that medication in the orange juice, we fooled them. We gave them a different glass of orange juice with a little bitter substance in it. So they believed that they were taking their medication, but in fact they weren't. So now we could test them off drug and on placebo when they believed they were on their drug. And a second group got the same thing, but in a different order, so it's not confounded with time. And then after that, we gave everybody the real orange juice and tested them again on the active drug. So that was another comparison condition. Okay, and you can hear me okay, right? You still with me there?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Great. Okay. Pressing on. So what do we test them on? Well, we tested them on two tasks, a motor task and an operant learning task. And this was the one we focused on in this paper. And the idea of the learning task is it's a task about learning from reward. So you make two simple choices. You choose symbol A or symbol B, make a choice, and then you either win money or you don't win money. And over time, you'll learn, if you have a reward learning system is intact, you'll learn to choose the choice that's rewarded more often. And that happens gradually over time. We also have a punishment learning condition. And what we expect, in brief, is that people who have Parkinson's disease have a deficiency in the reward learning system selectively. So we expect an impairment in reward learning systems and not punishment learning systems. And also some studies in healthy people with levodopa, as well as in patients, suggest that when you give people a dopamine replacement, they get more dopamine, then they show a selective benefit for a reward learning task. So what we find is exactly that. And what you see here are curves for learning across time. The black line is off drug, and the green line is on placebo. And what you can see is that they learn faster. They make those optimal choices faster. And the interesting thing is they also make the choices faster when they get the actual drug. But in this case, the benefit for the placebo is just about as strong as for the real drug. We don't see the effects of learning from punishment. Now, when we look at the brain, we're scanning the brain during this time. The basic circuit for this kind of reward learning involves interactions between the ventral tegmental area in the midbrain, the nucleus accumbens, and the ventromedial PFC. And one take on this is as follows. Your expectations about the value of that reward, what you expect when you choose a given option, are maintained in the VMPFC and associated circuits. And when you get a reward, you either get the $10, let's say, or you don't, then the midbrain dopamine system in the VTA projecting to the nucleus accumbens is activated in proportion to the degree that it's better than expectations. So if you expected on average $5 and you got 10, that's going to drive the dopamine neurons up. So that's this orange pathway there. Now, how do you calculate difference from expectations? Well, you need that representation of expected value in the VMPFC. So it's this expectation that's compared with what's coming in that you got, and it's that difference that drives the dopamine system and drives learning. So how do we find that in the brain in our patients? Well, the simplest way to do this is to fit a reinforcement learning model, which makes predictions on every time they make a choice and every time they get an outcome about what the expected value of reward is and what the prediction error is. And then we fit that regressor to each patient's time series and fMRI data and look for places where there's a good fit. And what we find when we look at the correlates of expected value, off drug, we don't see much. On drug, we see the ventromedial PFC correlating with value. And on placebo, we also see that correlation with value. And when we compare the drug, placebo and no drug, we see a causal effect of placebo in the ventromedial PFC. So that means that the signals related to expected reward value are enhanced, we think. And if we look at these curves across time for placebo, real drug, and no drug, again, we see a benefit for both placebo and real drug versus no drug that are approximately equal. Okay. Now I'm going to come to the last part, which is some of the newer work that we've been doing. And it integrates ideas about conceptual value and learning together. So one of my favorite studies these days is this clinical trial. In this clinical trial, they were studying, it was an industry-funded trial, and the company, the biotech company, was investigating a gene therapy treatment for Parkinson's disease that had shown great effects in papers published in Science and Nature in monkeys. And so they started doing this in humans. So it's AAV2 neurotrinin, and they inject this into the striatum, dopamine-rich areas of human beings, and they're trying to introduce genes that boost dopamine function. And this is what happens when they get that treatment. What you're seeing is improvements up to 2 years. So there's a dramatic improvement in the first 6 months, and that improvement is maintained for 2 years. But this trial failed. Why did it fail? Because if you look at what's happening with the placebo group, they got a sham surgery. It's just about as strong, and they stayed better for 2 years. And this resulted in the drug company being sold off for parts. I mean, they stopped this treatment, so it might never see the light of day. So what's happening? How can a placebo effect, a sham operation, possibly have benefits on a neurodegenerative disorder like Parkinson's for 2 years? I think it's still a mystery. But in other studies of pain, we also see cases, several cases, where the placebo effect seems to grow across time. And that's very unusual, because often what is happening is if you give somebody a sham treatment, you're giving them a cue that says, hey, expect less pain, but without delivering an actual analgesic. And so if they actually feel more pain than they expected, they ought to say, hey, that didn't work quite as well as I expected it to work, and the placebo effect should go away over time. And that's called extinction, and that's one of the best known effects in learning. If you give treatment cues or other cues without that reinforcement, then the effect should go away. But here, sometimes they're growing, or at least they're stable over time. And how is this possible? Well, it's possible if there's a feedback loop where the more pain relief you expect, the more you experience, and the more you experience, the more you expect. And this kind of feedback loop might be created if that experience is also a teaching signal that changes your expectations. So in a sense, what this is showing you is that you are getting the pain that you expect. And if you really feel that pain that you expect, and that's teaching you what to avoid and what to pursue and what to, what's going to happen in the future, then you might get this self-fulfilling effect. So here's a study that we did to test this. And we called it symbolic conditioning because it's a conditioning paradigm without any actual reinforcement. So people saw a series of shapes, like these two shapes here. And after every shape, we gave them a picture of a thermometer. And we said, this is reflective of low pain or high pain later. But right now, it's just a picture. So people learned conceptually the associations that one shape meant low pain, one shape meant high pain, without actually getting any primary reinforcement. So a lot of the systems that might be conditioned in a classical conditioning, we wouldn't expect, because it's really a conceptual effect. And we wanted to ask, what are the possible effects of this conceptual procedure where there isn't any standard classical conditioning? And now, later, they did a pain test where they got the same shapes, and they were followed by actual painful heat, safe, not going to damage the skin, but still painful. And we give them identical levels of heat for each of the two types of cues. And then we can tell what are the causal effects of those cues on the responses to the heat. So we'll always say green is the low pain cue, red is the high pain cue in the following slides. Now these cues are never reinforced, so they should cause extinction. We should see that effect, if there is one, disappear over time. So what do we see? These are pain ratings for the high pain cues, and they are much stronger than for the low pain cues. So that's a really big effect. Of course, that's what people tell us, but we can also look at their skin sweating, autonomic responses to those painful events, which are very robust. And again, the response is substantially larger for the high pain than the low pain cues. So that demonstrates a physiological response that has to be mediated, as far as we know, through the brainstem. Now, this experiment was special in a way, and this was actually, I should have updated the slide here, but it was actually just came out in Nature Human Behavior this last year, so 2018. You can find the paper. This paradigm allowed us to do something a little bit special, which is we have an independent manipulation of the expectations with these cues and an independent manipulation of the experience with painful heat of different levels. And by independently experimentally manipulating those two things, we can model or estimate what both of these reciprocal limbs of this circuit look like. So we can model both the effects of expectation on experience and vice versa. And this gives us an empirical demonstration of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So first of all, what do these effects look like over time? Well, on the left, you see study 1. On the right, you see study 2, a replication in the scanner. And the solid lines are the pain ratings with high and low cues, and the dashed lines are expectation ratings. So the first thing that you can see is that effect of the cues on pain does not go away over time. The red and green lines are different. Also, people's expectations do not converge over time. They don't go away. So people are still expecting a lot of pain relief, you know, with the low Q, and a lot more pain with the high Q in both studies. So they have failed to extinguish. And people's initial expectations are maintained. So the nice thing then is what we can then do is model each part of that circuit. So here on the left, what you can see is we've modeled what's the relationship between your expectations of pain and the pain rating on the next trial. And you can see across 5 levels or quintiles here, for both Q types, there's a very strong relationship. So expectations influence pain. We can also model what are the effects of pain on your subsequent expectations. And the more pain you get, then the more pain you expect on the next trial for that Q type. So that's also a very robust effect. So now we have behavioral evidence for a self-fulfilling prophecy. What about the brain response? Well, these are all areas here where the brain responds more strongly to the same intensity of heat with the high pain versus the low pain cue. A lot of targets of nociceptive areas. And another story is we've done a lot of work over the years in developing a more specific machine learning driven signature that tracks pain very closely and doesn't respond to a lot of other kinds of emotional events, like looking at other people in pain or negative emotional photos and other things. So we call that the NPS. And we can look at the NPS response. And here what we see is that the NPS response is significantly higher with the high pain cues than the low pain cues. And that is significant because another paper we just published across 20 different studies of placebo showed very, very tiny effects of placebo treatments in general on the NPS. So we think that this effect here, the way we've done the conditioning, is substantially stronger than most placebo treatments. So that shows us that our cognitive expectations can have powerful effects without primary reinforcement or standard classical conditioning. The experience, physiology, and brain move towards expectations. Now, that's part of what creates a self-fulfilling prophecy, but it's not enough. So what we showed in our paper and found is that if your experiences move towards your expectations to some degree, that puts a damper on learning, but it can't create a self-fulfilling prophecy or a truly self-reinforcing effect. If it did, you know, if what you expected, or what you felt, for example, was always exactly what you expected, we would be hallucinating all the time. You know, so it's actually not very likely that we have those very strong modulatory effects very frequently. So there's a second mechanism, and I'm going to show it to you in the form of this model. We did a number of computational models that look at these effects that I'll show you. So this is one pathway where we have some noxious input, a teaching signal, and a pain response. Now that teaching signal, the sort of endogenous reinforcement signal, gets compared with the cues at level 2. So you've got a cue, and that leads to a pain expectation. And when those two things are compared, that generates a prediction error. So if it's more painful than you expected, that would be a PE, and you update the cue value. You update what you expect. So that's a standard learning circuit. Now, one modulatory effect is a pain modulation effect. So if you expect more pain, the reinforcement learning signal is enhanced. So that's one short circuit. And that's what I just showed you. And that's one significant effect. But there's another effect here. And that effect is a confirmation bias effect. So what we tested was this idea that not only do we have pain modulation to some degree, we also have a confirmation bias in learning. So when you get that prediction error, something is more painful than you expected or less, if you expected a lot of pain, and in fact, it is very painful, you say, yep, that pretty much matches my expectations. I'm gonna treat that data point as valid. I'm gonna learn from that. But if you expected a lot of pain and you get something that disconfirms that expectation, it doesn't match, you say that must have been a fluke. So you discount that data point and you don't learn. And that's true for both high and low pain cues. And that's an effect that is not a typical part of the reinforcement learning literature. It's something that's relatively new. And only a handful of papers that I know of have really looked at that. So if that's true, then that's another kind of short circuit. So you believe the experiences that match your initial beliefs, and you disbelieve the ones that don't match your prior beliefs. These simulations actually are things that just simple simulations that show you that you really need both effects. And so I won't dwell on that here. So here's some empirical evidence that there are confirmation bias effects. And what you see here on the y-axis for study 1 and study 2 is the learning rate. And the learning rate is defined as the change in expectations after you get an experience that is either greater or lesser than you expected, and it either matches or doesn't match your prior, the Q value, your prior expectations. So in both studies, what I've starred here are the cases where the experience matches in sign the expectation. Like high pain and high pain expectation and it's more painful than expected, or a low pain expectation and it's less painful than expected in red and green respectively. And what you can see is the learning rates are substantially higher when the experience matched the expectations than when it didn't in the bars without stars. So those were significant effects in both studies. And we also confirmed that with a whole series of hierarchical Bayesian models that really provided convincing evidence to us that both the pain modulation effect and the confirmation bias and learning effect are real and are operative here. So that's the idea, that there are really two distinct mechanisms. One, expectations are shaped by experiences, dampening learning. And the second, that we tend to learn from the things that we already believed in the first place. So what that means is, under the right conditions, initial expectations are really, really important. And that can make the difference between resilience and recovery versus fear and avoidance. So for example, if I'm injured and I just believe at the start that this could be really terrible and this means something terrible for me, those expectations may enhance the pain. And I'll pay more attention to the days when it's worse. And I'll say, yes, those will confirm that I really am disabled or injured. And I will discount the days when I'm feeling better. I'll say, well, that was a fluke. And so if I start off with this negative pattern or negative, fear and avoidance expectations, in fact, my experiences will confirm that. And I will enter into a cycle of disability and disuse. Conversely, with positive initial expectations, there's a greater chance that I will enter a virtuous feedback cycle of resilience and recovery. And when you look at the clinical literature on chronic pain, as well as other areas, I think it's clear that your initial fear, anxiety, catastrophizing about pain prospectively predicts how well you're going to do after surgery. So the people, for example, who have lots of negative beliefs about pain, about their somatic symptoms, and a lot of depression, they don't do as well after the same surgery as somebody else who has less fear and avoidance and anxiety and greater chances for recovery and good outcomes after the surgery. So this does play out in real life. So I think one of the frontiers then is, how do we work with people to develop the right kind of mindset in approaching health and illness and surgery and other things before they've already gone down this road. So to summarize, we talked about how placebos work and about what some of their long-term impacts might be. And we talked about the idea of symptoms as emergent properties or inferences that are based on your prior beliefs combined with your experience. We talked about the idea that your beliefs determine what you learn from experience. So learning isn't just something that happens to you either. It interacts with your prior beliefs, and your beliefs guide what you take away from experience. And finally, learning can affect sensory input and nociception sometimes, but more often it affects interpretations of that input that then shape learning. And those interpretations, how you understand what's happened to you and happening to you, that has an impact on your long-term well-being and trajectory. So that has the potential to create self-reinforcing cycles. I'm going to end here by thanking my lab, who's been terrific. I told you a little bit about them before. A lot of great people. Also, the funding agencies that have supported our work on this over the years. We couldn't do it without these funding sources, especially the NIH, National Institute of Mental Health, and National Institute of Drug Abuse, and many others. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vijay. Okay. Just unshare it so that you can.
Got it. Okay. There we go.
There you go. Thank you very much. It's really, I'm a neuroscientist. I look at basically the signals and all those things. This is an interesting concept. I know about in the real life experience. So I think we don't have much time in here. So I'll ask one question I have is what you are trying to establish, kind of like when I go back and think about it, kind of like alternative medicine, right?
Yeah.
So how do you consider, I feel because I don't believe in alternative medicine, but I know some of the people who do, very close friends.
Yep.
And they always take those allopathic, what is that? Some other kind of vegetable, this kind of other things, and they say it is works for them. So
right.
Have you tried anything, those kind of medicine, trying to look at those kind of literature or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you really look at controlled trials of many alternative medicines, there's very little evidence that they work. Some of them are harmful. Yep. So this is a big controversy still today, and people are promoting treatments, vitamin injections in your butt, all kinds of different things, right? Yeah. Rubbing cannabidiol oil on your skin, all kinds of things. I'll stop there. But, there's probably very little active benefit, like many of the things I talked about with surgery. And there might be a benefit of actually engaging positively in the treatment, believing that, and having this sort of watershed moment where before you weren't taking care of yourself, and now you are. And so the rules have changed for you. Now you're allowed to notice those positive experiences and to engage in a sort of virtuous cycle of attending and remembering those positive experiences. That actually could be helpful. The thing is that, we all have to decide what to believe. And I actually don't believe in daily life that it's ethical or the best thing to take a sham medication, which might be costly, which might keep you from using other treatments that are better, and which might even be harmful. So if there is a benefit of, self-healing essentially and engaging in positive treatments, there are probably better options than paying somebody a lot of money for a fake drug or something. So I think we got to decide, what to focus on and pursue the things that actually work. But realizing that the very act of engaging in something, it could be an exercise program and that have other benefits too. So,
Yeah.
Is probably the better way to go.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So I think we are out of time. Basically, it's more than an hour. So I really appreciate it. It's a very interesting talk, and I really appreciate you taking time and giving us this opportunity for everybody to learn about your work and learn more about this placebo effect and all those things.
Yeah.
So look forward to more of your work.
Yeah, thanks. And if you have a link to the recording,
Yeah,
that'd be awesome too. I'd love to see it.
I'll send you the link once it is done.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, you can post it if you want on your website or anywhere. Like, you're free to do it. It'll be on our website for a long time.
Sure, sounds
Okay.
good. All right.
Thanks, Tor.
Well,
Bye.
bye.